What does auditory processing disorder have to do with jelly beans? Are you kidding me? Hi, my name is Angela Alexander, and I'm a detective. Totally a lie. I'm an audiologist. So I'm a hearing specialist, and I specialize in something called auditory processing disorder. And when I am collecting evidence of an auditory processing disorder, I think about it almost like a jelly bean. Think of one jelly bean as a single piece of evidence of auditory processing disorder. One piece of evidence, one jelly bean. Now, where do we find evidence of auditory processing disorder? We find the evidence in a person's symptoms and in their test results. So let's pretend that this jar is someone. We find their symptoms and test results in their jar. So this is one person. Perfect. Now we only get one jar, so we have to make the most of it. Some people have a lot of evidence and some people have less evidence. But no matter what, our goal is to identify what that evidence is and to reduce it as much as possible. There are a lot of different symptoms of auditory processing disorder. And when a person first comes to us, all of these symptoms can feel really confusing. It looks like this to them. But for those of us who specialize in auditory processing disorder, we know how to categorize problems. So the problems look more like this and this and this. I'm going to show you how I categorize these jelly beans in order to figure out what a person's problems are. Because once we get clarity on their problems, we can get clarity on their solutions. And honestly, it ain't rocket surgery. I want to take a moment to address something. Someone says labels are for jars, and they are right. Labels are for jars, because how can you tell if something is flour, sugar, or whatever, unless you have a tongue? Why? Angela, you're such a weirdo. Why can't I be more boring? Labels are for jars, not for people, right? That's what a lot of people say, and I understand where they're coming from. The only reason to have a label, in my opinion, is to come up with a solution that matches the problem that a person is having so that they don't have to live that problem anymore. A lot of people wonder if it's worthwhile testing for auditory processing because they think that there's nothing you can do about it. Well, there are loads of things to do about auditory processing disorder. There is in-person options, group therapy options, even apps to help auditory processing abilities. Auditory skills can change through something called auditory training. This is my 20th year in working with auditory processing disorder, and I have seen people who feel absolutely traumatized on a daily basis from this difficulty, and it doesn't have to continue. So we can treat auditory processing disorder. We would never say that auditory processing is curable because that's just not scientific language, but we can say we can treat it and we can reduce the evidence of auditory processing disorder that we see in a person's life. We only get one jar and we have to make the most of it. How many of us have gone to a doctor and we look at our symptoms for whatever it is that we're facing and it all looks confusing? This happens to everyone, right? And based on all the symptoms you say to them, you feel like they will feel as confused as you do. They're not going to have solutions for you. Well, that's probably how a person feels when they have auditory processing disorder, or if their kid has auditory processing. They think that all of this evidence is going to confuse us and overwhelm us like it confuses and overwhelms them. The cool thing is that audiologists who specialize in auditory processing disorder can actually categorize these difficulties. So they can separate each color of these jelly beans or each category of each jelly bean into their own separate jars. And when we separate them into their own separate jars, we can get super clear on what a person's problem is, the severity of their problem, and also solutions. We don't necessarily talk about curing auditory processing, but we can reduce the impact of auditory processing disorder through something especially called auditory training. Auditory training is where we actually train our brain so that we can understand what we're hearing better. The amazing thing is that when we compare a person's test results and their symptoms, we can figure out their problems. And when we know what their problems are, we can figure out solutions. And that gives us clarity. So why do I call them problems? Because I shouldn't be an autist, except people with auditory processing issues are struggling with understanding what they hear. So we have the same goal. When a person walks into an audiologist's office, they sometimes have a very different goal than the audiologist does. People with auditory processing disorder come to us because they can't understand what they're hearing, sometimes in quiet, sometimes in noise, sometimes it's remembering what they hear, sometimes it's organizing what they hear. And I have seen people who feel absolutely traumatized on a daily basis from this difficulty, and it doesn't have to continue. So we have the same goal. The audiology clinician who tests for auditory processing understands that you want to understand better, and the client wants to understand better. So it's really nice because our goals are aligned. And that's not always the truth in a standard audiology office. It doesn't matter what else that person has going on. If they've got any other neurodiversity, if they've got hearing loss, whatnot, we can reduce their jelly beans. When we look for evidence of auditory processing disorder, we can see it in a person's test results and in their symptoms. This is what happens sometimes in a clinic, though. Sometimes a clinic isn't using tests that are very sensitive, that can pick up on very much. And so they don't actually get test results that show what those symptoms are. And it's a little bit of a problem because even though the client comes in and they show so much evidence of auditory processing disorder, the test results aren't showing it. And that means that some people who go in who think they may have auditory processing issues have a test and are told you don't have APD and no suggestions or recommendations are made. But we really need to pay as much attention to the symptom jelly beans as the test result jelly beans. And by doing that, that immediately makes us more client-centered. So great audiologists care as much about these as they do about those. So if you're telling your audiologist you have a problem, even if the test results don't show that problem, the audiologist should be helping you with these symptoms. We put all the blue jelly beans in a blue jar, the yellow jelly beans in a yellow jar, the green jelly beans in a green jar, and the red jelly beans in a red jar. And once we do that, we create clarity because we know how to sort all of the evidence. The way that I learned to sort all of these jelly beans was through a man named Jack Katz. Jack Katz is turning 90 this month, and he is still working clinically in Kansas City. In fact, a few of you watching this may have actually already worked with him. Amazing! I don't know if you know it, but he's kind of a legend. Anyway, he created a whole lot of textbooks for audiology, but audiology doesn't realize that auditory processing disorder is actually his greatest work. He did this amazing thing where he was able to pick symptoms and test results that matched each other. How was that? Was that video editing any good? Jack Katz, PhD, is the one who created the Buffalo model. And what I love about the Buffalo model is it is very academically and life relevant. So we're going to talk about the different categories of auditory processing disorder, what you might see at home, what you might see at school, and different things that you can do to help kids or adults in those situations. This is how Jack Katz came up with the Buffalo model. He took 200 clients. He did an analysis of variance and an analysis of covariance on 200 files, and he found out which symptoms match up with which test results. And once he was able to come up with what those problems were, he was able to come up with solutions to those problems. Now, there's not just one way of looking at APD, and Jack just has one of many different models. But what I love about what Jack does is it's so solutions focused. It's really academically relevant. It's also quite relevant to a person's day-to-day life. And it's not called the Buffalo model because buffalo wings are delicious, but they are. But he created it at the University of Buffalo in New York. I'm about to take you through a questionnaire, but instead of calling it a questionnaire, I'm going to call it jelly beans. So I'm going to walk you step by step through the symptom jelly beans of blue, green, yellow, and red. Now, how this questionnaire was created was Jack Katz asked 170 clients whose children who had been diagnosed with auditory processing disorder to fill out the questionnaire you're about to go through. He didn't call it jelly beans, he just had them ticking yes or no. He also asked the families, do you also have a child who does not have any concerns for auditory processing in your family? And would you mind filling out the questionnaire for them too? So he got a clear idea of how people would normally answer this questionnaire with no difficulties, and people who do end up getting a diagnosis of auditory processing disorder. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you look through blue, green, yellow, and red jelly beans and tick the items that you think most pertain to your situation. Now, you're going to save all of those screenshots, and then I'm going to give you one more extra assorted jelly bean of some other general auditory processing issues. And what I want you to do is I'm going to have you add up all of these. We're going to calculate it and we're going to analyze it together and figure out where the next step is for you. I can't wait to get started. What about you? And before I do it, you might be wondering, how many flavors or colors of jelly beans does a person normally have? Well, most often they have at least 2 colors. Sometimes they have all 4. Ooh. If they have just one category of auditory processing disorder, they likely can compensate to make up for it. And blue jelly beans are the most common. And that could be actually due to a referral bias, because most of the people who come to our clinics come because of academic issues. Now, all auditory processing issues can be treated. It just matters what we treat it with. And we need to make sure that we apply the right solution to the right jelly bean, because if we are using red jelly bean solutions on blue jelly bean problems, you can tell that's not really going to help much, right? We need blue jelly bean solution. We need red jelly bean solutions for red jelly bean problems, right? I am just about to take you through a process where you're going to analyze your own symptom jelly beans. Isn't that amazing? Let me tell you about the categories of the Buffalo model. The first category is blue. It's the blue jelly bean. And we call that decoding. Decoding is your ability to quickly and accurately understand speech. Can you recognize sounds? Can you recognize words? It might seem like you can, but there are tests that we can do to look at this with a fine-tooth comb to see what kind of problems might be there. I have a list of all of the symptoms of the blue jelly beans. Screenshot it and tick the ones that seem to most deal with your situation. Here are the different problems that a person can have if they have a decoding problem. They can have trouble recognizing speech sounds. When they're learning to write and there's an M or an N, they might write the wrong one. They can sometimes have a hard time learning how to spell for that same reason. They can sometimes respond really slowly. If you say something to them, it might take a second for them to respond. Sometimes they can have a difficult time also saying sounds. Sometimes they have difficulties reading out loud. Sometimes they have difficulties learning a foreign language. They can have difficulties following spoken instructions, and their speech can be really indistinct or unclear. Now, what decoding usually means is, can you take a small piece of stimuli in your environment, put it into your brain, and can your brain quickly and accurately identify what that is? So if you go up to a tree and you look at a leaf, it'll help you know what that tree is, right? If you have a pine needle, you know that's a pine tree. If you have a palm frond, you know that's a palm tree. If you have an oak leaf, once again, you're not Canadian. What, Angela? Decoding is taking a small piece of stimuli into your brain and recognizing it. Now, people who have a really hard time understanding what they hear can often have a problem with decoding. We have just analyzed your blue jelly beans. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to count up all of the tick marks that you have on that screenshot. So I'm going to be able to give you clarity on what normal people, quote unquote, have ticked on the jelly bean list, what people with mild auditory processing issues tick on the APD list, and what people with moderate auditory processing issues tick. So that's going to help give you some clarity on how to move forward. How many tick marks do you have for the blue jelly beans? Now let's add them all up. And let's look When a person had no concerns about auditory processing issues, there was one item ticked on this questionnaire. So if you see only one item ticked for the blue jelly beans, we do not think that blue jelly beans are a particular difficulty for you. The next one is 2 tick marks. If there are 2 items that seem relevant to you, then it is likely that you will show mild auditory processing test jelly beans as well. If you see 6 or more items ticked, it is more likely that you will have a moderate problem with auditory processing. Now, all of these things need to be confirmed by an audiologist, and you would want to find somebody who specializes in the Buffalo model so that they can actually tell you how many decoding signs they saw on your testing. Let's say a person has a hard time recognizing speech sounds. They have a decoding problem. What do you think we should do if they have a hard time recognizing speech sounds? We should teach the person the speech sounds, and we can totally do that through something called auditory training. It's amazing. Decoding is actually the subcategory of auditory processing disorder that is the easiest to treat with Buffalo model auditory training. Now, you can find clinicians who specialize in this at apdsupport.com/APD map. If you go to apdsupport.com, you will actually see a map where you can find a clinician who does this work near you. Now, look for Buffalo model auditory training in order to get your jelly beans dealt with. The green jelly beans are something we call TFM. TFM? What the TFM is that? All right, T stands for tolerance, and that means tolerance of background noise. And FM means fading memory or short-term memory issues. People who have difficulty tolerating background noise often have short-term memory problems as well. I have all of the TFM green jelly beans listed. Take a screenshot and tick the ones that seem to pertain most to your situation. Symptoms of TFM are distracted by noise, difficulties understanding speech and noise, hypersensitivity to noise, responding too quickly, interrupting other people talking, forgets things that have been told, problems remember spoken instructions, or have difficulties with executive function. They can even have symptoms that are quite similar to, crossover with, or commingle with ADHD. So these people have difficulties with prefrontal cortex. People who have ADHD diagnoses are likely to also have problems with tolerance fading memory, or TFM. While those two are not the same symptom, they both co-occur in the same area of the brain. So the green jelly beans are tolerance fading memory, TFM. Green jelly beans. How many green jelly beans do you have? Let's find out what's within normal limits. The normal limits are 3 green jelly beans. 4 ticked items is consistent with a mild auditory processing difficulty, and 10 or more items is consistent with a moderate or more severe auditory processing difficulty. How many jelly beans do you have? Now, all of these things need to be confirmed by an audiologist. So tolerance fading memory, what do we do to help people with that? If people have difficulties hearing in background noise, and if they have a hard time with short-term auditory memory, guess what we do? We train a person to hear in background noise. What? We practice it with words, and we give them support. We give them feedback. It's amazing. Why not? The yellow jelly beans we call org, or organization, and that's the ability to keep proper sequence or order of information. So if a person tells you a number, 785-312-4400, do you remember it as 785-312-4400, or do you remember it as 758-213-4040? Did you switch the order there? That could be an organization issue. I have all of the yellow jelly beans listed. Take a screenshot and tick the ones that seem to pertain most to your situation. Symptoms of organization include troubles sequencing verbal items, difficulties keeping things organized, And a person can even be messy and tend to lose things. So it can physically manifest itself. These people can be all over the place. I'm glad you can't see my desk right now, to be honest. For organization, on average, a person ticked one item in the organization category. If a person has more of a mild to moderate difficulty, they're likely to show 3 tick marks of yellow jelly beans. What do you think we should do if a person has a hard time sequencing what they hear? We teach them how to sequence what they hear. We use digits, we can use letters, we can use instructions. We can teach a person how to sequence what they hear. The red ones are integration. Difficulties taking information in from both hemispheres of the brain. I have all of the red jelly beans listed. Take a screenshot and tick all of the ones that seem to pertain to your situation. Just tastes like red. If you have 1 tick mark in the integration category, we are not overly concerned about integration being a category for you. If a person has 3 or more ticks, they are likely to have a mild or moderate problem. How many jelly beans do you have? What should we do if a person has a hard time listening to something in one or both ears at the same time? We could practice it. What? Amazing. And that's how we get rid of red jelly beans. Sick. How do you add up all of your jelly beans? Well, if you've been taking screenshots and ticking the ones that match your situation most, I want you to look at these jelly beans. Tick as many as you have there. All of these can have some type of remediation, but you can imagine that if you apply blue solutions to a green problem, that's not ideal. Or red solutions, yellow solutions to a red problem, that ain't ideal either. You want yellow solutions to yellow problems, blue solutions to blue problems, green solutions to green problems, and basically you want to reduce as many of these jelly beans as possible. And it's totally doable. I'm telling you, I've seen it. I have some different jelly beans that are kind of assorted flavors. So these aren't to one category in particular, but they're just general potential auditory processing signs. Look through these other associated symptoms with auditory processing difficulties. Ticking 1 of these is within normal limits. If you tick 2 of these, you are likely to have a mild difficulty, and 4 of these, a more moderate difficulty. Okay, so we are going to analyze the symptom jelly beans that you have. Symptoms. Let's count our jelly beans. How many jelly beans do you have? Is it normal? Could it identify that you have some difficulties? Now, if you have 8 or more jelly beans that you have selected off of all of those screenshots, you are most likely also going to have test results that represent an auditory processing disorder. This may be a really good self-check to check to see if auditory processing testing is something that would be helpful for you. Regardless, if you're having some difficulties understanding what you hear, or you feel like this is preventing you from living your best life, it's totally worth going and getting checked out by an audiologist. Start off with getting a hearing test first, just to make sure that there's no hearing loss present. And then secondarily, you can check apdsupport.com/APD map to see if there's a specialist in your area who both diagnoses and treats auditory processing disorder. Tell them I sent ya. Tell them you saw these reels. They're going to think that's ridiculous. Okay, you probably want to talk about ADHD, right? Because I've already kind of opened up that can of worms or beans. Let's say we've got some gumballs in this jar. It might be hard to tell the difference between gumballs and jelly beans, right? They kind of look alike, kind of like ADHD. ADHD and auditory processing disorder can look similar to each other, but we can reduce the evidence of auditory processing disorder. We can reduce the jelly beans in this jar. ADHD gumballs can look like or act like the the APD jelly beans, but reducing the APD jelly beans can actually improve a person's life to the point that the gumballs are not as big of a deal. It doesn't matter what else that person has going on. If they've got any other neurodiversity, if they've got hearing loss, whatnot, we can reduce their jelly beans just like this. Oh, it hit my tooth. Ah. I have eaten so many jelly beans. What color was that one? Pink. Cotton candy. Let's talk about hearing loss. Hearing loss is a little bit like throwing a peppermint inside this jar. So a peppermint with jelly beans can change the flavor and the presentation of the jelly beans, but it doesn't necessarily mitigate the jelly beans. You can have auditory processing issues in addition to hearing loss, and we can still reduce the APD jelly beans. Who cares about the peppermints? I mean, the peppermints are going to be there. We can overcome hearing difficulties with amplification, but that doesn't normally change a person's need for something in addition to that amplification. So we can do auditory training for people with hearing loss and reduce their jelly beans. Now, all of these things need to be confirmed by an audiologist, and you would want to find somebody who specializes in the Buffalo model so that they can actually tell you how many signs they saw on your testing. A lot of people have been reaching out asking where they can get services, and maybe you've noticed the very last screen in all of my reels is a link to my APD support map. So go there and find the clinician nearest to you. This is my daughter. What's up, Iz? Yes, dear.
Can I please have a jelly bean?
Which color would you like?
My favorite color is purple, so I go for the purple.
You'd like a purple one? I like to call those one localization jelly beans. Do you know what localization of sound is?
Oh.
It's where you know where sound is at in your environment. So like we just heard the dog come in and we know that the dog is behind us now, right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
I got another.
Are you eating all those localization jelly beans? Localization might be the 5th category. It hasn't totally been figured out yet, but that could be where all the other categories bisect. Be interesting. What do you think of that? Cool. All right.
I also want this one.
You also want a blue one? Those are decoding ones. Those are super delicious to eat all up. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.